Lots of people in our industry are obsessed with innovation. Companies talk about innovation all the time. People talk about innovation all the time. If you spend any time on LinkedIn, you get inundated with posts about new products, new systems, new goods-to-person technology, new AI something, new industry 5.0 something. And I do believe that companies and people alike are focusing on the wrong type of innovation. Instead of improving the tools that we already have or making the tools that we have cheaper, startups and corporations alike focus their efforts on developing new, fancy technology that aims at doing something completely different. And I don't think that this path is going to be successful. And in this video, I will tell you why. A few months ago, I was invited to give a presentation at a company as part of a sales training with international company representatives. The title of the talk was The Future of Intralogistics. And I've given similar presentations before, so I knew what I would be talking about, even though I developed the outline from scratch. But I had a good idea what points I wanted to make. And the presentation was very well received, even though, or perhaps precisely because, I believe that what I delivered in terms of the presentation was very different from the expectations that existed prior to the talk. And I believe what the company was expecting was a presentation about artificial intelligence, drones in warehouses, robots, of course, probably humanoid robots also. And if you know me a bit, then you know that I'm not very keen on engaging in hype talk. I like to keep things as simple as possible, and I prefer to use the tools that we already have rather than fantasize about some future technology that is going to deliver the golden bullet. And yeah, this isn't what keeps LinkedIn running, but still, that's me. All right. Now, recently, I have run 2 AutoStore tenders, and one of the interesting findings in these projects was that one of the interesting realizations that I had was that one of the most expensive and tedious parts in these tender projects was the conveyor system. The AutoStore part was easy, also because AutoStore salespeople from the various distributors, they know roughly what they are talking about when they talk about AutoStore. Yes, they are overselling. That's part of their job, I guess. Not quite as bad as those people on LinkedIn who are overselling AutoStore and mistake that ASRS for a religion. But that's for a different discussion. But the conveyor system, that was really a painful part of the project. And we ended up signing the contracts for the AutoStore systems without the conveyor system. And we decided to finish the conveyor part of the project later and award those parts of the project separately. Now, there are lots of people who talk about innovation. There are lots of people who make a lot of noise on LinkedIn about the latest ASRS, about next-gen GTP solutions and robots and blah, blah, blah. But you know what's really missing? Cheap conveyors. The kind of prices the distributors were asking for the conveyor part of the system, for the conveyor system, that was insane. Now, I can show you what I mean by insane. Do you see this little piece of conveyor here on the screen? This is a not okay exit. So order totes that are released from the picking stations, but fail some test, or we know there's some problem and we need to double check them, they're supposed to exit the main conveyor, which comes up here, before they go to the goods out area. So this is an exit for order totes that need checking. Now this is less than 4 meters of conveyors. It's a little curve. Doesn't have to be a curve, could be a pop-up diverter, because we are talking about a low traffic system. And then we have, what is that, like 3 meters of undriven roller conveyors. So can you guess the price that was asked for this little piece of conveyor? Well, in the first offer, it was 21,500 euros. In the second offer, it was something around 17,000 euros for less than 4 meters of conveyor, including a curve. And, well, we asked for undriven conveyors. I don't know if they made this driven conveyors. But let's assume let's assume in favor of the supplier, let's assume they accidentally quoted driven conveyors instead of undriven conveyors. 4 meters of driven conveyors, 21,000 euros, really? And so how is this going to work? How is this going to work for systems that, that are intended for small and medium-sized companies, the kind of companies that would be interested in an AutoStore system, an entry-level AutoStore system with 20 robots, 30 robots, 40 robots, at the price point of somewhere between 2 and 3 million euros. How is this supposed to work if a simple conveyor system alone would cost almost 1 million euros without any fancy stuff? But you need some conveyors to transport the totes. And I just don't get it. I don't understand why these things have to be so expensive. Now, in the meanwhile, we have 25 different ASR systems for goods to person picking. We have tons of different AGVs. We have a ton of companies that claim to be innovative, but we can't build conveyors that a normal company can afford. That doesn't make sense to me. Now, on a related note, Attabotics, you may have heard the news, Attabotics just declared bankruptcy. And this is, of course, not great news. This is sad. Attabotics had an interesting system. Now, there are lots of theories as to why Attabotics didn't make it, as to why they had to bite the dust. And I would like to add one perspective. Now, you may have seen the article that I wrote some time ago about, what's the title? On the power of good enough. On the power of good enough. And in that article, I make the point that a system that is good enough and affordable will always beat in the market a system that is better, but more complicated and or more expensive and or less proven. And I use AutoStore as one example. I use Vitron, the Vitron case picking system, as another example. And Attabotics is one example for a system that I'm sure can do some things better than other ASRs like AutoStore, perhaps. But the system is so much more complicated. There are so many more potential problems that can arise. It is so much less proven and also arguably more expensive than AutoStore that it doesn't make any sense to even think about it. Now, you can say that about a number of different systems in the market. And, I am a big fan of AutoStore, not because I think that AutoStore is such a superior system. I don't think that AutoStore salespeople on the internet do a particularly good job in in terms of honesty, especially on LinkedIn, I think some mistake AutoStore for a religion rather than an ASRS. But the great thing about AutoStore is its simplicity and the fact that it basically always runs, and that so far AutoStore, the mother company AutoStore, has not screwed up the technology or made it so complicated or complex that it has become more expensive to maintain than necessary. And so I believe that companies like Attabotics and various other companies in that cube storage market will have a very hard time to succeed, because they're not as much better as they are more complicated. They are not as much cheaper. They're not cheaper at all. I think I haven't come across a system that was cheaper, actually. They're not as much better as they are more expensive. And that's a problem. So you can be more expensive if you're better. But basically, if you're dealing with an incumbent company with a proven concept, and at the time I'm recording this video, AutoStore has more than 1,200 installations, which makes it the most successful company in the world, or the most successful technology in the world for warehouse automation, for ASRS. There's no other system that has as many installations as AutoStore, to my knowledge. So if you're competing with a system like this, you have to be much better or much cheaper. And so far, none of the competing companies is either much better or any cheaper or any better. Or they are better in some aspects, but better is a difficult term. They have some properties that are better than the equivalent properties of AutoStore, like less sensitivity towards ABC distribution, less sensitivity towards floor slab quality, things like this. But then the whole package has to compete. We're not competing on individual properties. We're competing with the entire package. And so far, I'm waiting for a system that can beat AutoStore in its performance and simplicity and price and reliability, all of that in combination. And that's a very hard thing to pull off. And Attabotics obviously didn't do it. Now, Attabotics and AutoStore are not quite comparable, because Attabotics is not technically, well, you could consider it a cube storage system, but it's actually not as dense, because you have all those chimneys. So you end up with a system that has a similar density as a double deep shuttle system or a double deep mini load system. And if you had the triple deep mini load systems, those exist. If you had a triple deep mini load system, probably your storage density would be higher. Of course, your performance would probably be lower. That's a different story. So I'm not surprised Attabotics didn't make it. And I will not be surprised if over the next couple of months, as the funding's running out, because many companies are still living on that money they got during the COVID automation hype, when interest rates were zero and there was lots of stupid money in the market. Now those times are over. There's still stupid money in the market, but not the same amount. So they're still living on that, from those investments. They're living on those investments, but they're not going to get more investments at the same scale as they used to. So they will be running out of funds. And I predict we are going to see quite a few bankruptcies of once hyped startups in the next 12 to 16 months. I would be very surprised if that did not happen. Now, I would like to make a broader point here. I think for many systems that have been developed in the ASRS domain, or more generally in the space of warehouse automation,
the companies or the people who developed those systems were never quite clear about which problems they wanted to solve. And so we have a bunch of new systems, especially in the GTP segment, where it is not quite clear what the unique selling point is actually, and why the new system should be better than other existing systems. And again, there are systems that are better in some aspect, that have some properties that represent an improvement over existing features of existing ASRs. But then the question becomes, could we have improved the existing ASRs a tiny bit to address that issue, to render any effort to develop a new system redundant? And I believe sometimes the answer is yes. And especially when ASRs and GTP, that's one thing, but especially when I think about transportation systems like AGVs or conveyors, I think the answer is absolutely yes. We do not need fleets of AGVs for transportation tasks. These are niche products so far. We need cheap conveyors. Really, we do need conveyors that can be sold at a price point that makes sense for more companies, because that's a real problem. And developing new technology doesn't do the trick. I think we need to make the existing technology more affordable, and that should be possible. There's no reason why 1 meter of conveyor should cost 5,000 euros. That doesn't make any fucking sense.
Do you remember the company Six River Systems? Six River Systems was acquired by Shopify in 2019, just before COVID, for a whopping amount of 450 million US dollars. Just to be sold 4 years later in 2023 by Shopify to Ocado for less than 13 million US dollars. So what was the problem here? Now, Shopify's financial situation aside, because that wasn't the problem. The problem was that Six River Systems had a silly idea to begin with, and was providing a solution that wasn't delivering any tangible benefits to anybody who would understand the basics of warehouse management and warehouse optimization. Their claim was to improve warehouse productivity 2x or 3x. And from the very beginning, first time I walked into people from Six River Systems and they made this claim, I thought this was utter nonsense. I asked them, how? How are you going to do this? And then they showed me their robot, Chuck. And Chuck was basically an automated pick cart. It was a small AGV carrying probably 4 order totes, and the initial idea was to use Chuck in a follow me kind of system. And that is a stupid idea. Follow me systems don't make a lot of sense. They pivoted from that idea later to introduce something like zone picking. Now, I would bet a lot of money if you compare a system that is running on Chuck, and Chuck is an expensive piece of technology combined with an expensive piece of software that you would have to acquire or pay per month. If you compare the performance of a warehouse that is operated with Chuck with the performance of a warehouse that is operated with the pick cart that I'm going to show you on the screen, this pick cart that is being used by Picnic that transports somewhere between 12 and 21 order totes at a time for multi-order picking, I would bet a lot of money that that manually operated pick cart, this large thing that looks like a cheap aluminium frame would perform better, would enable pickers to make more picks per hour. It costs just about nothing in investment and enables high operating performance. So you have to ask yourself, what were these people thinking? Now, the problem with Six River Systems is that it was addressing a symptom, low pick performance in a warehouse, which was caused by underlying, or in many cases is caused by underlying problems. Because pick performance as a variable is easily identified, is easily counted, is easily analyzed. But the reasons as to why we have a particular pick performance, as to why we can observe pickers to achieve a certain number of picks per hour, that is often not to be found within picking, but it is to be found within inventory management. It is to be found within designing the right picking process. It is to be found in having the right equipment in the picking process. And if you ignore all of that and you just put Band-Aid on the symptom, on the bleeding wound, which would be that chuck robot, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so there will be enough companies that have no clue what they're doing in logistics that will fall for this narrative that a simple AGV-based pick card will double or triple the warehouse performance. But there will not be enough companies to keep Six River Systems afloat. And well, the history has clearly shown this is the case. Now, this is just one more example. There are a lot of different examples in warehouse tech and in other technological domains where technology is developed without a clear understanding of problems, of underlying problems. So that, as I said, I predict we are going to witness a lot of bankruptcies in the startup domain in the next couple of months as funding runs out.
So working with the tools that we already have, I believe, is an absolutely underrated attitude, and making the tools that we already have more affordable is something that is utterly unsexy, but it is way more important than coming up with the next ASRS for GTP. And of course, you're not going to get rich from other people's money, like investor money. You're not going to get large VCs excited about your company when you're making your conveyor systems cheaper. Nobody is going to talk about you on LinkedIn. But you're actually doing something that's useful. And I believe financially, in the long run, you will be more successful than most of the next-gen GTP picking ASRS startups that have been dominating the warehouse automation news in the past 5 years.
Now, whenever I say things like this, I run the risk of sounding like your grandfather who didn't want to have power windows in his car or air conditioning and thought all of that stuff was unnecessary and nonsense. But that's not how I want to come across.
So just to get this straight, the point I'm making is not a statement against the development of new technology. So I'm not against innovation. I'm not the guy who says, we already have everything we need, let's stop all that R&D crap. That's not the point I'm going to make. That's not the point I have made in this video. The point I am making is that we mistake the novel for the innovative. also we mistake the novel for the better. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's better. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's better. If you want something that is much better than what we have, yes, then probably it has to be different. But just because it's different, it's not going to be better. That's not the same thing. And I believe, as far as practical needs are concerned in our industry, as far as the companies that I've been working with over the past couple of years are concerned, I believe for them, a breakthrough would be a conveyor that cost half as much as 5 years ago, not a conveyor that has more features and IoT capabilities, but cost 3 times as much as 5 years ago. That's not what they have been waiting for, and that's not what I think will deliver any benefit to the industry. So let me end on this. I hope I could get my point across. And as always, I'm grateful for comments. I always appreciate honest feedback. If you want to talk, do let me know. Thank you very much, and goodbye.